I've seen the fire in our nation's eyes when anger prowls for prey. I've heard good people draw their lines and call it holy rage. But the cross was never raised to bless the stones we throw. And if mercy leaves the house, there's something wrong down in the soul. Words ain't bullets, but they can hit the same. And once a heart turns cold enough, it forgets what grace is for. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No, no room for hate. No room for hate. You can wave a flag above it, you can quote a verse or two, you can dress it up like justice till it almost sounds like truth. But outrage ain't righteous when it changes with the side. And you can't love your neighbor treating them like they're downrange. We're all image bearers, breath of God and dust. And you don't heal a broken land by teaching it not to trust. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No room for hate. No room for hate. Drag it to the cross, lay it in the ground. Let the blood of Jesus turn the whole thing around. Truth can still be spoken, courage still can't stand, but rage don't get to rule the soul of a faithful man. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place.
Let revival start where the anger breaks.
Where the anger breaks.
Let healing rise up where the hurt gives way.
No room for hate.
No room for hate.
No, no room for hate.
No room for hate.
Not in Jesus' name. Oh, not in this house. Not in this heart. Not in His name. No room for hate.
Hello, friends. Do you have a moment so that we may discuss our Lord and Savior Minarchy? No, seriously, I'm just kidding. Hi, my name is Rick Robinson. I am the general manager of KLRNradio.com. We are probably the largest independent podcast network that you've never heard of. We have a little bit of everything, and by that, what I mean to tell you is we have news, pop culture, special events, conspiratainment, true crime, mental health shows, drama productions, and pretty much everything in between. So if you're looking for a new podcast home to grab a little bit of everything that you love all in one place, come check us out. You can find us on X under @KLRNradio. You can find us on our Rumble and our YouTube channels under the same names. You can also find us at KLRNradio.com and pretty much every podcast catcher known to man. So again, feel free to come check us out anytime you like at KLRNradio.
Remember when entertainment was actually entertaining? When comedy was about being funny, movies were about telling great stories, and you didn't need a political lecture every time you hit play. Great entertainment still exists, it's just getting harder to find. Even the biggest streaming platforms leave audiences disappointed. That's why there's Studio TST, pure entertainment, real comedy, independent films, bold creators, movies, comedy, music, and more, and the home of fearless sketch comedy. That show tonight, entertainment the way you want it. Funny, creative, unapologetic, and agenda-free. Studio TST. The future of entertainment starts here. Join Studio TST today for just $5 a month.
In uncertain times, we could use someone to lean on. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma will stand by you with plan options to fit your budget. If you've recently lost your job, had a baby, or moved, you can still get the healthcare coverage you and your family need. Financial help may be available for those who qualify. Call 855-452-BLUE or visit hereforyouok.com to see if you're eligible to enroll. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma, a division of Healthcare Service Corporation, a mutual legal reserve company.
Hi, everyone. This is JJ, the co-founder of Good Pods. If you haven't heard of it yet, Good Pods is like Goodreads or Instagram, but for podcasts. It's new, it's social, it's different, and it's growing really fast. There are more than 2 million podcasts, and we know that it is impossible to figure out what to listen to. On Good Pods, you follow your friends and podcasters to see what they like. That is the #1 way to discover new shows and episodes. You can find Good Pods on the web or download the app. Happy listening.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
The following program contains coarse language and adult themes. Listener discretion is advised.
From red dirt roads to the
How you doing, America? How you doing, America? Welcome in to the Oh My God, It's Monday again edition of the Rick Robinson Show. You know, I probably need to write a song about how much Mondays suck. Although since I'm retired now, they don't really suck as much as they used to. However, the weekend was a lot of fun. I had birthday palooza. So I had granddaughter's birthday, had granddaughter's birthday on Saturday, grandson's birthday on Sunday, because he's going fishing all next weekend on his actual birthday. So they did it yesterday. At which, 16 years old, getting to go hang out and go fishing with your friends. Why the hell wouldn't you? And then last night, my daughter's birthday is July 10th. Speaking of which, since I never wished her a happy birthday on the air on the 10th, happy belated birthday, dear. So yeah, my aunt wanted to do a birthday dinner with her, and last night was the only night that could work, which is why there was not a Kingdom and Country last night. But we did 2 hours the other night that I think I've already archived, I think. So I kind of made up for it anyway. And there'll be 2 hours again this Wednesday because Steven's going to be off. So I guess I'll be making up for lost time as we go. Anyway, it's Monday. So interesting thing happened. And we talked about it a lot on Friday's show. I will help you write that song. Actually, I will probably take you up on that, Mr. McMasters. I probably will. All right. Anyway, you should message me sometime. We should seriously talk about that. Anyway. All right. Welcome into the program. I hope everybody's having a great Monday. I know it's Monday. How can Mondays be great? That should be, if Trump decides to run for a third term, I know people's heads explode every time I say that because he can't technically. I get it, but it's still a fun tongue-in-cheek joke. That should be his entire slogan, though. Make Mondays great again. Although that would be one he would probably fail at miserably. All right. So Friday's show, we talked about a lot of what he talked about during his speech that half the news folks didn't want to carry. I'm going to say this again, though. If you accuse someone of lying and then don't show people the lies, doesn't really hold up very well, in my opinion. I am a firm believer that sunlight is, in fact, and always has been the best disinfectant when it comes to stuff like this. And that's how today's show became built. So there's all kinds of things we could be talking about. I could be talking about how, the supposed domination of Spain's soccer team was boring as hell. Because it was. I watched part of it yesterday, and I'm like, I used to love watching my brother go and play, and I had some cousins that played indoor soccer too. I love to go in person. It's another one of those sports I can't really get into on TV. And it doesn't help when, yes, they might have dominated the possession time, but it took until what they call extra time, I think, what we call overtime, to finally score one goal. I'm like, dude, this was anyway. Look, congratulations to Spain. I'm glad you took it all. A lot of folks I know were cheering for them after we lost. I didn't really care. I think we should go back to hating soccer again as God intended, and I said that earlier today. And there are plenty of other things I could be talking about that we will get into on Wednesday's show and then probably again on Friday's show. But for now, we're going to do one of those things that I do from time to time and connect a lot of dots that have been kind of lingering. And everybody, when I start trying to connect the dots, always says, you don't know what you're talking about. And then the more dots that come to fruition, the more I connect and the more people are like, maybe you're not as crazy as I thought. Notice I didn't say not crazy. I said not as crazy as I thought. Anyway, so again, welcome in. This is the Rick Robinson Show. And of course, I am Rick Robinson. Today, we're going to do something that apparently Americans are no longer supposed to do. We're going to look backward with the benefit of hindsight. We're going to put documented events beside one another, preserve the distinctions the evidence requires, and ask whether the official story explains the whole pattern, because every individual fact we're going to be discussing today has been handed an individual and separate explanation. The political exercises before the 2020 election that are just now starting to come to light, those were only contingency planning. The second round of exercises before the 2024 election, that was only another responsible effort to protect democracy. The FBI election security official reportedly saying she was basically running a shadow government across the bureau. Oh yeah, Rick, that's fine. She was only joking. Maybe it was even exaggeration. The field intelligence report recalled after concern that it might contradict the FBI director's testimony. That was only quality control. The presidential briefing allegedly massaged to keep election-related information away from the president himself. Oh, that's just routine editing. The confidential human sources around January 6th, present, perhaps, but not officially authorized to break the law. The missed pre-event canvass. Oh, that was only an oversight. The Capitol security failure, confusion inside a complicated chain of command. The Pelosi detail testimony reportedly challenged by surveillance footage. Oh, that's just a disputed recollection. There's no way to prove that he actually meant to lie. The agency reviewing its own witness. Oh, that's just standard procedure. The burn bags that have just come to light that Obama used. Oh, those were just ordinary containers used for sensitive documents. Every individual fact in this story that we're going to be talking about today through the entire 2 hours has been handled an individual explanation. Maybe some of those explanations happen to be correct, but at some point, responsible analysis requires us to stop examining every tree as though the forest does not exist. Because trust me, the forest exists. I want to be clear about what I will not be claiming today for legal reasons. I am not claiming that the political exercises prove a criminal conspiracy. I'm not saying they disprove them either. I'm not claiming that every person who participated endorsed every tactic discussed, because that would be nearly impossible. I'm not claiming the FBI ordered January 6th. However, there are some interesting dichotomies going on there. I'm not claiming Nancy Pelosi caused the riot because she didn't, but she used it, and we're going to get into that later. I'm not claiming every witness discrepancy proves perjury. However, when you're flat out lying about where you are and a camera shows you're somewhere else, I'm sorry. I know according to the FBI that didn't meet their standard, but that's a pretty damn low bar in my opinion. And I'm not claiming every sensitive document in a burn bag was part of a cover-up. The evidence does not support those conclusions as established facts at this time, but refusing to leap beyond the evidence does not require us to ignore the evidence we do have. An exercise does not prove execution, it proves preparation. The question is, what were they preparing for? Because it shows what people considered possible. It identifies the institutions they believed could have been mobilized. It reveals the relationships available before the emergency arrived. It rehearses tactics, communication channels, pressure points, and responses. And when similar exercises occur more than once with overlapping organizers and the same categories of institutions, the repetition itself becomes quite relevant. One may be contingency planning. Twice begins to look like doctrine, not necessarily illegal doctrine, but a developed institutional theory of resistance. The story begins way back in 2020 with the Transition Integrity Project. According to the project's published report, more than 100 people from politics, government, campaigns, law, media, academia, and advocacy participated in exercises built around possible election outcomes. Publicly associated participants included such names as John Podesta, Donna Brazile, Jennifer Granholm, Michael Steele, Bill Kristol. Yes, that Bill Kristol. Hi, Captain Stooping. How you doing? David Frum, Rosa Brooks, and Nils Gilman. The exercises were described as bipartisan, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, although the publicly identified Republican participants were generally prominent Trump opponents rather than representative of Trump's governing coalition. That distinction matters. The presence of people who once held Republican credentials does not automatically make an exercise politically neutral, and this one, in my opinion, was not. When the common premise is that Donald Trump presents a unique danger requiring coordinated resistance. And again, role play does not prove that every participant personally endorsed every move made by the side he or she represented. That is how exercises work. Participants are assigned roles and asked to test scenarios, but the scenarios themselves tell us which possibilities organizers considered realistic enough to rehearse. The project considered a disputed election, delayed results, mass demonstrations, pressure on elected officials, congressional resistance, competing claims of legitimacy, and the use of state and institutional power during a transfer of power crisis. So in other words, what they basically wargamed was kind of what happened on January 6th, just not in the way that they were hoping it was going to go. One scenario reportedly involved Trump winning the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. And this is where it gets interesting, because in that exercise, the Biden side did not simply concede and prepare for the next election. It explored resistance through governors, congressional Democrats, public pressure, and competing slates or alternate claims involving electors. That report also contemplated demands involving statehood and structural political changes, along with threats that some states might consider secession. Now listen carefully to the distinction. Alternate elector efforts later became central evidence in the argument that an insurrectionary claim and scheme had been attempted. But when elite political figures rehearsed competing elector tactics as part of a resistance to a Trump victory, the exercise was treated as prudent democracy planning. The difference was not always the tactic. Sometimes the difference was who was expected to use it. That is not proof that the exercise became an operational plan. It is proof that tactics, later described inherently unthinkable, had already been contemplated by respectable institutions when directed against Donald Trump. If a building catches fire and you later discover that influential people had gathered beforehand to rehearse how they would respond to smoke, which doors they would control, which alarms they would trust, which authorities they would contact, and how the public story would be managed, that meeting does not prove they started the fire, but it becomes relevant when you investigate why certain doors were open, why others were closed, and why the final report describes the emergency the way it does. That is what makes the 2024 Democracy Futures Project important. This was not simply a replay of the 2020 election certification exercise. The Brennan Center reported that the project conducted 5, yes, I said 5, tabletop exercises involving approximately 175 participants from former government services, the military, law, business, labor, media, activism, faith, communities, and other institutions. Most of the exercises assumed Trump had won and explored how institutions might respond during a second administration. The focus had shifted. In 2020, the central question was the election result and the transfer of power. In 2024, the question was how an institutional resistance network might operate after voters returned Trump to office. Organizers would say confidentiality allowed participants to speak candidly. That is a legitimate reason for privacy. But when influential people rehearse how government, corporations, courts, media, labor, activists, and bureaucracies might coordinate against an elected president, the public interest in knowing who participated doesn't disappear. The complete participant list was not publicly released. But now it was a second exercise involving overlapping organizers, familiar institutions, and the same central premise: coordinated resistance to Donald Trump extending well beyond ordinary electoral opposition. Now, this has been a theme. We're only focusing on 2020 and 2024 today because I've done 2016 in earnest, and 2015, 2016 was much the same way. We already know, thanks to documents that have been uncovered, that there was a coordinated CIA, FBI, and sitting presidential campaign to first derail a presidential candidate, then derail a presidential nominee, and then hamper the transition of the president-elect. So this is not just a pattern that extends from 2020 to 2024. This has now been shown to be a throughput from 2016 all the way through 2024. So once could be considered contingency planning. Twice begins to look like a formation of doctrine, not necessarily illegal on its face, but a developed institutional theory of resistance. That does not mean every institution followed a common command. It means a network had developed a shared language, shared assumptions, and a menu of choosable and acceptable responses. And that matters because institutions do not always need a secret order to move together. People who share the same premise can make similar choices independently. If the premise is that Trump is an emergency, or as he has been painted by the media and everyone else for the last 10 years, an existential threat to democracy, then ordinary rules become obstacles to protecting us from that existential threat to democracy. Resistance becomes what some consider protection. Withholding and trying to keep control becomes responsibility. Institutional defiance instead becomes patriotism. And when the real crisis arrives, the participants are not inventing their response from nothing. They have rehearsed the categories. They know which institutions may act. They know which tactics have already been discussed. They know which narratives will make extraordinary actions appear necessary. The exercises are not the verdict, but they are the context. Now, we're going to have to take a break here in a second. After the break, we move from people outside government rehearsing institutional resistance to a senior official inside the FBI reportedly describing herself as basically running a shadow government across the bureau. The exercise shows preparation outside the government. After the break, we begin looking at the decisions made inside it. I'm Rick Robinson. This is The Rick Robinson Show. Stay with me. We'll be right back after this break.
They tried to quench the fire, drown it all in chains, tried to break our will and wash away our names. But every spark they buried only fed the flame. Now the cry of freedom's roaring through the rain. Hear the cry of freedom on the winds of change. Every voice united
And welcome back into the program. Oh no, Al, you got to go to work today. I mean, I'm working right now, so I can't say anything, but still, have a good day, my brother. Try not to let the man get you down too much. Welcome back into the program, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so before the break, we started connecting a lot of dots. We established something important. The resistance to Donald Trump was not invented spontaneously after the 2020 election. If anything, we can prove that there was throughput all the way from 2015 through 2020 and beyond. So, prominent political figures, former government officials, media personalities, lawyers, academics, activists, and party leaders had already participated in exercises exploring how institutions might react to a disputed election. I almost said that in the Chinese way, and some of you will get that joke, and I'm glad I didn't. Then several of the same organizers returned in 2024 and conducted another series of exercises examining how government, courts, businesses, labor, media, activists, states, and bureaucracies might resist a second Trump administration. And in a lot of ways, it's been the courts doing most of the heavy lifting, and we can see that now. So we say this as if these things were just exercises, but they're being implemented, whether anybody wants to admit it or not. Maybe not in the way that that shows a definite, clear, and present danger, but enough there to know that there is avid resistance to Trump, the Trump administration, and the Trump policies, which I would be willing to submit that if they would just leave him alone, let him do his job, the country would be a lot better off. So those exercises do not necessarily prove that a criminal operation existed. They do not prove that every person involved endorsed every tactic discussed. However, they do establish preparation, relationships, and a shared understanding of Donald Trump as an extraordinary threat requiring extraordinary institutional responses. The exercises show us the architecture outside the government. But now it's time to move inside, because while influential political figures were rehearsing institutional resistance, the FBI had placed one of its senior intelligence officials at the center of election security. Her name was Nikki Flores. And this is not a case where we have to rely on somebody else's description of her importance. The FBI's own biography says Flores served as Deputy Assistant Director to the Bureau's Counterintelligence Division, where she oversaw intelligence and strategic functions for the counterintelligence program. The FBI also says she served as its election security lead for the 2020 presidential election. Before that, she had worked on the FBI director's daily briefing staff and helped produce executive-level briefing documents. You know, those very same things that we said were kind of being massaged. Yeah, that. In other words, Nikki Flores was not some anonymous analyst whose sarcastic office message was later inflated into a national scandal. And I guess I should put sarcastic in air quotes, because that's the whole well, she didn't really mean it. She was just trying to make a joke. She was a senior official with experience preparing information for the FBI director and overseeing intelligence connected to counterintelligence as well as election security. That context matters when we examine a message now attributed to her. According to newly declassified messages described in the president's July 16 address, Flores wrote that she was basically running a shadow government across the FBI. Now, I'm going to slow down here a bit because this is where people on both sides tend to sprint beyond what the evidence supports. I cannot tell you from that phrase alone precisely what she meant, but I can say that we can make an inference. But maybe she was joking. I doubt it, though. Maybe she was complaining that she had been given responsibility without matching formal authority. Maybe she was boasting. Maybe shadow government was colorful, bureaucratic shorthand for coordinating across organizational boundaries. While all of those possibilities exist, none of them make the phrase meaningless. The message attributed to the FBI's election security lead described her role in terms of a government operating behind or across the government's visible structure. For years, Americans who raised concerns about a shadow government were treated as conspiracy theorists. Then the Bureau's own election security lead appears to use the same language about herself. Was that phrase hyperbole? I don't think so. The public is still entitled to know what authority she was exercising, which offices she was coordinating, what information passed through her hands, and why that language seemed appropriate. Those questions become unavoidable when we place the phrase next to a specific decision made inside the FBI on September 25, 2020. One day earlier, on September 24, FBI Director Christopher Wray appeared before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. Wray was asked about the possibility of coordinating fraud involving mail voting. His answer was very carefully worded. He said the FBI had not historically seen a coordinated national voter fraud effort in a major election, whether conducted by mail or otherwise. He added that the Bureau took the threat seriously and would investigate it aggressively. That was the director's public testimony. According to records released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, the FBI's Albany field office disseminated an intelligence information report the following day. The report contained allegations from a confidential human source concerning possible Chinese involvement in the manufacture of fraudulent driver's license and potential mail-in voting activity. Let me emphasize the distinction here, again, primarily for legal reasons. An intelligence information report is not proof that the source was correct. It is not proof that the fraudulent ballots were actually manufactured. It is not proof that China altered our election. Raw intelligence may be accurate, partly accurate, misunderstood, unreliable, or deliberately deceptive. The proper response is to assess it, corroborate it, and determine what the evidence supports. According to the committee's released records, an Albany official described the report as having been coordinated and disseminated in textbook fashion. Another official reportedly said there was no reason to recall it. Then headquarters intervened. Minutes later, the report was ordered recalled. The Senate Judiciary Committee says Flores was among the headquarters officials requesting that very recall. The committee's release cites the FBI's stated concern that the reporting will contradict Director Wray's testimony, otherwise known as he may have committed perjury and we might have just given them the silver bullet to prove it. And after that, the report was pulled. Headquarters reportedly informed field offices that raw election-related reporting would require headquarters coordination, a requirement that had not previously been applied until now. That is the key sequence. The FBI director testifies publicly. The field office circulates intelligence that could complicate the public impression created by that testimony. Headquarters recalls the report. Then headquarters centralizes control over future raw election reporting. Again, this does not prove the underlying allegation was true. It raises a more fundamental question. Was the FBI testing intelligence against evidence, or was it testing intelligence against what its director had already said? I submit to you it was likely the latter and not the former, but that's just my opinion. An intelligence agency's job is not to ensure that incoming information agrees with leadership's public testimony. Leadership's public testimony should reflect the information available to the agency. When intelligence must be made to fit what leadership has already told Congress, the institution is moved from analysis towards narrative management. An Albany analyst reportedly recognized that danger. According to the Senate Judiciary Committee, the analyst wrote that the most troubling part was the statement that the reporting would contradict Wray's testimony. The analyst said that appeared political and ran against the FBI's mission to remain apolitical and state what it knew. The analyst also warned that political implications should not become a reason to suppress intelligence reporting. This is not a conservative commentator assigning motives from the outside. This is an analyst inside the process, reportedly objecting that the Bureau's reasoning appeared political. And the institutional principle is straightforward. If the report was weak, document why it was weak. If the source was unreliable, assess the source. If the report lacked corroboration, say so. If there was reason to believe China was feeding the Bureau disinformation, investigate that and then release accordingly. But this might contradict the director is not an intelligence standard. That is a political motive. And that is why all of this is flying in the face of everything that we've been told up until now. An email from someone who said they were that was involved in a chain with the same person who said that they were running a shadow government inside of the federal government itself, basically went along with the idea we can't let this out because it might contradict the then director of the FBI. That is a PR standard. That is an institutional self-protection standard. That is the moment that this stops being merely an election fraud story. It becomes an intelligence integrity story. And remember where we began today. The exercises established that powerful people were thinking about the coming election not merely as a contest between two candidates, but as a struggle involving government institutions, political networks, media narratives, courts, corporations, activists, and public pressure. Then inside the FBI, we find an election security official describing herself as basically running a shadow government. We find a field report recalled almost immediately. We find concern that it might contradict the director's testimony. Not that it was inaccurate. That's the point that I want to make here. This was not a claim that they were afraid the report was inaccurate. They were specifically concerned that it might contradict the director's testimony. And we find headquarters establishing greater control over election reporting afterward, which is something that hadn't happened before. At some point, we have to ask whether those institutions were functioning as natural collectors of information or as active managers of the political environment. That does not require a secret meeting or a written master plan. Institutional alignment can happen when people share the same assumptions. If officials begin with the premise that Trump represents a clear and present danger to our democracy, then information capable of helping him may receive greater skepticism, more layers of review, and more institutional resistance. Every decision can be defended individually as caution. The cumulative result can, and in this case, I believe can still be, well, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The cumulative result can still be considered political, and in my opinion, as we're looking at all of this now, it seems like it most definitely is. That is why the word massaged matters. President Trump said in his July 16th address that one of the newly released communications described a presidential briefing as being deliberately massaged to keep election-related information from reaching him. We need the complete communication in its full context. Briefings are edited constantly. Information is condensed all the time. Weak or duplicative reporting is removed. Unverified claims may be withheld until analysts have greater confidence. Those processes are normal and necessary. The critical question is why the information was removed. Was it excluded because analysts concluded it was unreliable or irrelevant? Or was it excluded because officials did not want Donald Trump to see information that might affect his decision or his public statements? If the answer is the latter, and based on what we've uncovered so far and gone through, I'm still leaning toward that one, then intelligence officials were not merely protecting the president from weak reporting, they were deciding what the elected president was permitted to know based on their judgment about how he might use that information. That would represent a profound reversal of constitutional authority. The intelligence agencies serve the elected government. The elected government does not serve the intelligence agencies. I'm going to stop right there for a second. Because, look, that is how this is supposed to work. The elected government is not supposed to serve the intelligence agencies. But if we're being really honest, this has been a case of the tail wagging the dog for quite some time. That is one of the things that Donald Trump ran headlong into all the way from 2017 through 2021. And that's why, as soon as he got sworn back into office, he started releasing all these reports that were found out about these mid-level bureaucrats that technically could not be fired. And even if they were fired with cause, they still had to go through this entire vetting process to actually be removed. And that's the same equivalent as what the military calls the E4 mafia. Because if you need something done and you don't necessarily care how it gets done, you go to an E4 and you find a way to get it done. This was the government bureaucracy version of the E4 mafia. They were the ones that were holding all the standards. They were the ones that were keeping information from getting where it needed to go. And they were the ones that were being told to stonewall, deny access, or ignore the president altogether a lot. And we know this now. This is something that I've been talking about since 2020, when the things from 2016 first started coming to light. And then now from 2024 forward, when all the information from 2020 and everything that happened back in 2024 is finally starting to come to light. Now, look, I understand there's nothing that can be done about these past elections. But the thing about it is we have to start being able to find a way to restore trust in our systems. And we can't do that with as broken as everything currently is. And that is just the truth of where we are today. Because career officials have a right to believe a president is reckless. I'm sure a lot of folks that were under Barack Obama probably felt that way. I know I sure as hell did, even though I wasn't a career official. However, even if they may believe such things as he might even misunderstand intelligence, it is still their duty to provide the commander-in-chief information that he may need to know. And they have been choosing over and over again to do that. And they may, and they did likely fear that he will misuse the information, but those beliefs did not create a separate constitutional authority, allowing unelected employees to decide what the president may know or when he may know it. That is the real danger contained in the phrase shadow government. It does not require a cinematic conspiracy. When people say shadow government, they think of all kinds of scary people hiding in the shadows, doing all kinds of unspeakable things. It can be as simple as we're going to control the information that's being relayed to the president. And that is the foundation that we're laying today. That is the foundation that Donald Trump set on Thursday, that we started getting into on Friday. And then even more stories started breaking, which is why we're doing a deep dive on this today. There's so many other things that I could be talking about. If you want to listen, if you want to go catch up on those things, feel free to go watch another show. This is the stuff that matters, because this is the stuff that nobody else wants to talk about. This is the stuff that people won't put out on YouTube because they're afraid their channels are going to get ganked. You know what? I don't care anymore. I truly don't. If we cannot be a nation that truthfully examines what is being done behind closed doors and having an open conversation about it, then you tell me how much we still technically have freedom of speech. You tell me how much we have any freedoms at all. Because this is very scary stuff when you think about it. I'm using very careful language today to describe it, but it is still terrifying when you think about it. Because what happens when bureaucrats decide they are the adults in the room and they start filtering information to a president? Now, we saw the other side of this from 2021 until 2025, because there were people controlling what Joe Biden had access to for different reasons. So they were using the system they already set up to try to keep Donald Trump from finding information out, to try to keep a defunct president on the rails for 4 more years. When they realized that, hey, he's not actually going to be a transitional president like he promised, because he thinks he's the only person that can beat Donald Trump. And who knows? He might have been right, if not for the fact that he lost his faculties somewhere along the way. And I'm going to be completely honest. If you look at Joe Biden in 2016 versus Joe Biden in 2020, he was already gone. They just didn't have a choice, because if they didn't put him over the finish line, they would have wound up with Bernie Sanders. And if you're seeing what's happening with the Democratic Party today, then you know why they never wanted Bernie Sanders to be in that position. The problem is, whether they like it or not, Bernie Sanders has positioned himself as the youth kingmaker in the Democratic Party, and he's winning hearts and minds. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a story that came out earlier today that Hakeem Jeffries has gone to Bernie Sanders behind closed doors and said, stop meddling in congressional elections. If you're winning the messaging point, you don't have to say things like that. And I'm going to say this to Hakeem Jeffries and all the other Democrats that are suddenly terrified that the socialists and the commies are in control of your party. This is exactly what we've been trying to warn you about for forever. You've used these people to foment anger. You've allowed institutions to be taken over by communists that now teach at every turn that America sucks. America is terrible. It was founded on evil principles. It never should have existed. And now in Act 2 of Don't Worry, the alligator's going to eat you last, you're now figuring out that Act 3 might be closer than you think, and you might be getting to be the last course of the alligator after all. So I have no sympathy for any of you. So here's the thing. Back to what we've been talking about today, though. It can be institutions convincing themselves that democracy must be occasionally managed because voters might choose incorrectly. This goes into exactly what I just talked about a moment ago. I've been saying now for months, if not years, that voters need to start being allowed to receive what they're voting for. We have both parties trying to treat voters as if the parties are the adults in the room and they know more what we need than we do. The only way that these people are ever going to find out how much this stuff sucks is if they finally get a taste of it. Because the folks in academia, the folks in political windows, they keep telling everybody, well, this isn't really communism and it's not really socialism either. And socialism and communism actually work. They've just never really been tried before. That is a lie. Because here's the thing. If we had been letting these people get what they voted for, say a la Bernie Sanders back in 2016, or even Bernie Sanders in 2020, they probably would have figured out how much none of these policies are ever going to work. New Yorkers are starting to get a firsthand lesson in this because the media is telling you that Mom Donnie has solved budget crises, has done this, has done that, has just now implemented rent freezes. Guess what's going to happen, though? It's all going to break the system, which is their design. That's the part nobody wants to talk about. These people that are running as Democrats are actually socialists. And if I were the Democratic leadership, I would be putting an end to this right now and be like, no, you cannot run inside of our party. I don't care how much of a big tent you say you want. These people are not Democrats. They are Democratic socialists. They have their own party platforms. They have their own party affiliations. They shouldn't be being allowed to run in the Democratic Party. Especially if you're trying to distance yourself from them. But Hakeem Jeffries, who was just a few days ago, talking about how, well, we want a big tent and we want everybody to feel welcome in the big tent, secretly telling Bernie Sanders to shut up and go away. That's interesting. That's interesting. But back to this institution convincing themselves that democracy must occasionally be managed because voters might choose incorrectly. Once that premise is accepted, withholding information begins to feel like it's the responsible thing to do. Shaping a briefing becomes prudent. Recalling a report becomes necessary. Centralizing intelligence doesn't become stifling, it becomes quality control. Resistance becomes patriotism. The participants do not believe they are subverting democracy. They, in fact, believe they're saving it. And that may be the most important theme of today's show. You do not need a cartoon villain for institutions to become dangerous. You need people convinced of their own virtue. People who believe the normal rules cannot be trusted when the wrong person wins. People who believe their access to information gives them a higher claim to authority than the public. Now, I'm going to back up to this other line a second. People who believe the normal rules cannot be trusted when the wrong person wins. This is what started happening in 2016 and again in 2020. The Democrats used superdelegates to make sure that the people that they wanted to be elevated to the position of presidential candidate made the final cut. If they didn't use that power, and if they didn't basically trust the voter who wanted Bernie Sanders because they didn't trust the voter, and they said, hey, this is the wrong person. We don't want any of this. We're gonna do this instead. This was the very beginning of the disenfranchisement that Democrats had been feeling, and then it was made even worse in 2024. Because in 2016, 2020, they could see who was trending upwards, and like it or not, it was Bernie Sanders. It was. That's just the truth of it. He should have been the nominee probably both times. Would we have won if he was? I don't really know, but I don't really care either. Because here's the thing. We have to start giving voters what they vote for so they can start learning from their mistakes. This is what I don't understand about this is a lot of these people that are in these positions have raised children, and they understand that at some point you can't keep holding your children's hands. We're doing the same thing with the voters. At this point, if these people think they can take the commie corridor and run with it and expand it, let them try. It's not like there aren't recourses. It's not like even if this works, it won't last more than a couple of years before everything starts falling apart and then somebody else has to step in to fix it. The question is for us making sure that the right people are in place to step in and fix it, rather than them saying, well, we tried, but the system was already so broken that we're just going to have to tear it down and start over, which is what I think they're really trying to do, if I'm being honest. But I digress a bit. People who treat procedure as sacred until procedure produces a reality they consider intolerable are the same people that we're talking about right now. And that's been going on for a long time. That belief can connect political exercises outside of government with information control inside of it, not because every participant is taking orders from the same person, because they share the same premise. Donald Trump is not a normal political opponent. He is an emergency. He's literally Hitler. He's a clear and present danger to democracy. And emergencies always justify exceptions. That logic helps explain why extraordinary resistance can be called democracy protections instead. It helps explain why intelligence inconvenience FBI leadership might require additional control. It helps explain why officials could feel justified shaping what reached the president. And it helps explain why the phrase shadow government might feel humorous rather than alarming to the person using it, but it should still inspire just a little bit of fear in those of you that are reading the stories that this stuff is pulled from and listening to me today. Now, we need to distinguish what is documented from what remains unresolved. The FBI's own biography establishes Flores' senior counterintelligence role and her responsibility for, you guessed it, election security. The Senate Judiciary Committee's released accounts saying headquarters ordered the Albany report recalled, that Flores was among the officials involved in that concern about contradicting race testimony, and that appeared in the stated reasoning. An Albany analyst reportedly objected that the process appeared political, because it was. Headquarters then required greater coordination of raw election-related reporting. What remains to be fully established is the meaning and context of the shadow government message, the complete circumstances surrounding the allegedly massaged briefing, and whether officials acted from legitimate intelligence concerns, institutional self-protection, political bias, or some combination of the three. That uncertainty identifies the records that must be examined. Who ordered each who ordered each change? Who approved the recall? What did the original report say? What did the source provide? What corroboration existed? What follow-up occurred, if any? What did Flores mean by shadow government? What information was removed from the presidential briefing? Who removed it and why were they authorized to do so? What justification was documented for for what they did? Was President Trump told that relevant but unverified reporting existed? Or was the existence of the reporting itself kept from him? Those are questions required for democratic accountability. Secret intelligence authorities cannot be permitted to become secret political authorities. The FBI can investigate threats to elections and does investigate threats to elections. It cannot, however, decide which election-related facts the elected president and public may know based on institutional convenience. The intelligence community can protect sources and methods. It cannot use classification or internal review to protect leadership from embarrassment. And government officials can prepare for emergencies, as long as they're legitimate emergencies. They cannot quietly redefine themselves as the government behind the government whenever voters produce a result they dislike, however. This is where the hour has taken us so far. We began with exercises outside government and that identified institutions, tactics, networks, and possible responses to Donald Trump. We then moved inside the FBI. There we found an election security leader using the phrase shadow government. We found politically sensitive intelligence being recalled. We found concerns that the reason for the recall was that they were afraid that it might contradict the director of the FBI at the time. We found election reporting placed under greater headquarters control. And we found an analyst inside the system warning that political implications were influencing intelligence decisions. None of this proves that the 2020 election result was changed. It does not prove that January 6th was planned by federal officials. It does not establish that the institutions later asking Americans for unconditional trust were not operating in a politically neutral environment. They had assumptions, they had institutional interests, and they had strong views about which outcomes endangered the country. But that, however, is not the end of the story. It is the environment in which the next part of the story occurred. Because in the second hour, we move from political preparation and intelligence management to January 6th itself. We will look at the FBI's confidential human sources, what the Bureau knew, what it failed to ask, and what happened inside the Capitol security structure. And then we will ask whether January 6th merely became useful afterward or whether some officials understood its potential usefulness before the breach. I'm not promising an answer that the evidence may not yet be able to provide. I am telling you the question can no longer be dismissed. The exercises were real. The participants in those exercises were real. The released internal communications are real and verifiable. The recalled report was real. The concern about contradicting the director of the FBI at the time was real. The only thing Americans are still being told is imaginary is the possibility that these facts belong in the same conversation. And as we're proving today, they do. I'm Rick Robinson. This is The Rick Robinson Show. We'll be back for hour 2 in just a minute. For those of you that are hanging out in the chat, make sure you are liking, sharing the feeds, telling everybody about us. I don't even care if you like us. Tell your friends anyway. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
when anger prowls for prey. I've heard good people draw their lines and call it holy rage, but the cross was never raised to bless the stones we throw. And if mercy leaves the house, there's something wrong down in the soul. Words ain't bullets, but they can hit the same. And once a heart turns cold enough, it forgets what grace is for. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No, no room for hate. No room for hate. You can wave a flag above it, you can quote a verse or two, you can dress it up like justice, till it almost sounds like truth. But outrage ain't righteous when it changes with the side. And you can't love your neighbor, treating them like they're downrange. We're all image bearers, breath of God and dust. And you don't heal a broken land by teaching it not to trust. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No room for hate. No room for hate. Drag it to the cross, lay it in the ground. Let the blood of Jesus turn the whole thing around. Truth can still be spoken, courage still can stand, but rage don't get to rule the soul of a faithful man. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place.
Let revival start where the anger breaks.
Where the anger breaks.
Let healing rise up where the hurt gives way.
No room for hate.
No room for hate.
No, no room for hate.
No room for hate.
Not in Jesus' name. Oh, not in this house. Not in this heart. Not in His name. No room for hate.
Hello, friends. Do you have a moment so that we may discuss our Lord and Savior Minarchy? No, seriously, I'm just kidding. Hi, my name's Rick Robinson. I am the general manager of KLRNradio.com. We are probably the largest independent podcast network that you've never heard of. We have a little bit of everything, and by that, what I mean to tell you is we have news, pop culture, special events, conspiratainment, true crime, mental health shows, drama productions, and pretty much everything in between. So if you're looking for a new podcast home to grab a little bit of everything that you love all in one place, come check us out. You can find us on X under @KLRNradio. You can find us on our Rumble and our YouTube channels under the same names. You can also find us at KLRNradio.com and pretty much every podcast catcher known to man. So again, feel free to come check us out anytime you like at KLRN Radio.
Remember when entertainment was actually entertaining? When comedy was about being funny, movies were about telling great stories, and you didn't need a political lecture every time you hit play. Great entertainment still exists, it's just getting harder to find. Even the biggest streaming platforms leave audiences disappointed. That's why there's Studio TST, pure entertainment, real comedy, independent films, bold creators, movies, comedy, music, and more, and the home of fearless sketch comedy. That show tonight, entertainment the way you want it. Funny, creative, unapologetic, and agenda-free. Studio TST, the future of entertainment starts here. Join Studio TST today for just $5 a month.
In uncertain times, we could use someone to lean on. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma will stand by you with plan options to fit your budget. If you've recently lost your job, had a baby, or moved, you can still get the healthcare coverage you and your family need. Financial help may be available for those who qualify. Call 855-452-BLUE or visit hereforyouok.com to see if you're eligible to enroll. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma, a division of Healthcare Service Corporation, a mutual legal reserve company.
Hi, everyone. This is JJ, the co-founder of Good Pods. If you haven't heard of it yet, Good Pods is like Goodreads or Instagram, but for podcasts. It's new, it's social, it's different, and it's growing really fast. There are more than 2 million podcasts, and we know that it is impossible to figure out what to listen to. On Good Pods, you follow your friends and podcasters to see what they like. That is the #1 way to discover new shows and episodes. You can find Good Pods on the web or download the app. Happy listening.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
The following program contains coarse language and adult themes. Listener discretion is advised.
From red dirt roads to the Capitol steps, Rick's calling truth.
And welcome back in, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I know it's Monday. I may have over-caffeinated today, so if I start seeming like Annabelle from the Muppets, you'll probably know why soon enough. Anyway, we're here. We're live. And, BZ, I don't view that as hate. I view that as proper discernment. Anyway, yeah, no, I'm just saying. You see that as there's room to hate the people who hate the country. I view that as discernment, not hatred, because I don't hate them for hating the country. I just treat them accordingly. Anyway, so we're back. We're live. Hour 1 is in the books. Hour 2 is still to come. If you haven't done so yet, please make sure you are liking, sharing, subscribing, following, whatever options you have available, depending on where you're watching us at. We are live on X, Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, and we'll be available on all the podcast platforms later today. I'm going to take a lunch break before I get caught up on my archives, though, so you guys probably won't see the podcast version still. I'm sure they probably won't drop officially on all the places till tomorrow. But it's always better to be here live anyway, and that's another reason why I've started delaying the pushing out of the audio versions, because y'all should be hanging out live. And I'm punishing you when you don't. Because I am a dictator, even if I am a benevolent one. Anyway, so we're back. We're live. Again, hour 1 is in the books. Hour 2 underway now. So welcome back. Again, it's Monday again. I know. It's also apparently Warthog Day again in Iran. Because, yeah. Anyway. So I just saw a report earlier today that certain groups in the Middle East are pushing for a 10-day ceasefire, I say hell to the no. We keep trying to do ceasefires with these people. They keep saying we're not going to have a ceasefire, so hell to the no. Anyway, so if you're just joining us in hour one, we follow the story from outside government to inside government. The 2020 and the 2024 exercises established preparation, relationships, contemplated tactics, and an institutional theory of resistance to none other than, oh my God, he's terrible in the orange. He's the orange man bad with a cat on the. I screwed that up, BZ. Sorry. I used to love the way you used to say that all the time, and I stole it for a while, but I haven't said it in so long. I just fumbled it. Anyway, so then we moved inside of the FBI. We examined Nikki Flores, the Bureau's election security lead, and the newly declassified communication described in the president's address that, almost nobody carried, in which she reportedly said she was basically running a shadow government across the FBI. We also examined the Albany intelligence report involving alleged Chinese election interference. The underlying intelligence was considered unverified, but according to records released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, headquarters recalled the report amid concerns that it could contradict what FBI Director Christopher Wray had just told Congress. That is where the issue stopped being merely about election fraud and became a question of intelligence integrity. Was the FBI testing intelligence against evidence, or was it merely testing intelligence against what its director had already said? But now that we've done all that, we've done all the heavy lifting, we've started setting the foundation. Now we're going to move back in the Wayback Machine a bit too, because there's more things that I feel have come to light based on these revelations regarding January 6th itself. So now we're going to move there. Once again, I want to begin with what I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming the FBI ordered the Capitol breach. I'm not necessarily claiming that they didn't either. I'm just saying I don't have evidence to support it yet, so I can neither confirm nor deny. I'm not claiming that every confidential human source in Washington was operating under FBI instructions. I'm not claiming that the Bureau formally told anyone to commit violence. Because, of course, they're not going to formally tell anybody to do that anyway. I'm not claiming that the presence of informants automatically proves the event was staged, but I am saying that the federal government had far more eyes, ears, access, and proximity inside the January 6th environment than the American public initially understood. And once that is established, and in my opinion, it has been established quite deftly, the question itself has to change. What did those sources know? What were they asked? What did they report? What did their handlers know? And why did a government with people inside the relevant ecosystem still claim to have been so surprised by this supposed insurrection? According to the Justice Department Inspector General, 26 FBI confidential human sources were in Washington for events connected to and surrounding January 6th. 4 actually entered the Capitol. Another 13 entered the restricted perimeter around the building. 3 had been assigned to report on particular subjects who might attend. The remaining sources reportedly traveled to Washington on their own initiative. The Inspector General found no evidence that the FBI authorized those sources to enter restricted areas, break the law, or encourage violence. That's what's known as plausible deniability, ladies and gentlemen. That finding matters for legal purposes, but I'm going to say this again. That is what's known as plausible deniability. The available Inspector General record does not establish that FBI headquarters ordered confidential sources to storm the Capitol, but it is not in the inquiry either. A confidential human source is not merely another protester in the crowd. A source has a relationship with the government itself. The source may have a handler, receive payment, seek favorable treatment, or depend on continued usefulness. And once a source enters restricted grounds or the Capitol itself, that source becomes part of the event the government is investigating, even if the source acted outside of instructions. Even if the handler did not know in advance, the government now has a responsibility to determine exactly what happened. What did the source do? What did the source see? Did the source communicate with a handler? Was the source interviewed, paid, prosecuted, or protected? Anybody remember that guy who was all over the video and then just disappeared? Yeah, guys like that. And was the source's conduct disclosed to defendants whose cases depended on what happened in those same spaces? Presence is not necessarily orchestration, but presence creates knowledge, opportunity, responsibility, and leads to things that can be put on record. The tasking, handler communications, payment history, source reports, after action interviews, and charging decisions should all be examined together. The government cannot say these people were trusted enough to serve as confidential sources and then ask the public to treat their conduct as irrelevant once they entered the most politically consequential crime scene in modern American history, according to the left. And there's another problem. The Inspector General found that the FBI did not conduct the pre-event nationwide canvass that officials later acknowledged should have occurred. I'm going to say that again. The Inspector General found that the FBI did not conduct the pre-event nationwide canvass that officials later acknowledged should have occurred. I need you to think about that for a second. The country was heading towards a nationally advertised protest in Washington. The president was disputing, and in my opinion, rightfully so, the election results. We can agree to disagree, but I think there's enough evidence there to where I'm going to say what I always say: where there's smoke, there's fire. Congress was preparing to meet for certification. Political tension was extraordinary at the time. The FBI knew that subjects, groups, and events of interest might converge in none other place than Washington, D.C. itself. It had confidential sources connecting to parts of that environment, yet the Bureau apparently did not take the basic step of acting its field offices. What are your sources hearing? Who's going? What are they planning? Are there threats? Are there weapons? Is anyone discussing violence or, maybe discussing breaching the Capitol? Deputy FBI Director Paul Abate reportedly called the canvass a basic step that was missed. That's not a minor paperwork mistake, though. That's not as simple as like an accountant moving a comma or something. That's huge. With everything that we knew, with all the media coverage and everybody talking about, oh my God, it looks like the president wants to have people storm the Capitol to overturn the results, even though they had to selectively edit what he actually said at the rally beforehand to make it sound that way. You would think these same people who apparently did not and do not trust Donald Trump would have done their legwork. But the question becomes, why didn't they do their legwork? Is it because they planned the whole thing? Is it because they thought that once it started taking shape, it was going to be a useful way to distract from all the things that we're talking about today? We're going to get into more of that later. But this, again, is not a minor paperwork mistake. It goes to the heart of what an intelligence organization is supposed to do before a foreseeable national security event. You collect, you coordinate, you compare, you assess, you warn when applicable. The Bureau had sources, the event was known, the risk was obvious, and the canvass, for some reason, was not conducted. The Inspector General also said its review did not identify potentially critical intelligence about an attack on the Capitol that had been kept from law enforcement partners. Why was it kept from law enforcement partners? That finding matters, but the same report concluded that the Bureau had well-placed sources, could have developed a more complete threat assessment, and missed a critical opportunity by failing to canvass them. Then the FBI later gave Congress an inaccurate account, suggesting that such a canvass had in fact occurred. The Inspector General attributed that inaccurate account to confusion rather than intentional deception. Maybe that's correct, but notice how often institutional confusion appears precisely where clarity mattered most. Look, we can argue about these things called coincidences all day long. I, for one, do not believe in them. We have now used the phrase confusion around a situation more than once in the discussions that we're having today. The word confusion is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting, in my opinion. The report was recalled because of concerns about the director's testimony. The presidential briefing was allegedly massaged. The election security chief used the phrase shadow government. The Bureau had 26 sources in Washington. Did I go backwards? I feel like I went backwards. What happened here? Maybe not. Sorry, I think I accidentally bumped my mouse. Trying to get back to where I was in my notes. Okay. So no, I guess I didn't. I guess we were just going back over it again. So the same report concluded that the Bureau had well-placed sources, could have developed a more complete threat picture, and missed a critical opportunity by failing to canvass them. So here's the thing that we went into a second ago. Notice how often institutional confusion appears precisely where clarity mattered most. The report itself that we discussed earlier was recalled because of concerns about the director's testimony. The presidential briefing was allegedly massaged. The election security chief used the phrase shadow government. The Bureau had 26 sources in and around Washington, D.C. on the day of January 6th. 17 entered either restricted grounds or the Capitol itself. The Bureau failed to canvass its own sources nationwide. Congress later received inaccurate information about whether the canvass had occurred at all. Each explanation may be individually possible and even plausible. The issue is the accumulation that we are discussing. At what point do repeated failures that repeatedly leave the same institutional narrative protected require us to consider something more than bad luck? At what point does incompetence become indistinguishable from intent in its practical effects? Because for all intents and purposes, you can't really tell the difference anymore in everything we're discussing about whether this was incompetence or some form of intent. That matters because when a failure is not deliberately engineered, institutions can still benefit from it. And once they benefit, they acquire an incentive to explain the failure in the least damaging way possible. That is where source handling becomes especially important. There are allegations from whistleblowers and congressional investigators alike that FBI leadership pressured field offices to produce domestic extremism cases and demonstrate that the January 6th threat existed nationwide. Those allegations must remain allegations until the exact directives, testimony, and internal communications are fully established. But there is already a documented controversy over how January 6th cases were geographically categorized. Whistleblowers allege that Washington directed field offices around the country to open cases based on where individual suspects lived, even though the underlying event occurred in Washington itself. The whistleblower alleged that this allowed the Bureau to present January 6th related investigations as evidence of a nationwide domestic extremism phenomenon. Oh, come on. You know you heard it in your head too. The defense would be that local field offices commonly assist with suspects living in their jurisdictions. That is typically a reasonable assumption, but if those local case openings were then used to statistically to claim a broad nationwide surge, the method may have in fact shaped the very conclusion they were looking for. And if leadership pressure reached field offices and handlers, it could have altered the incentives surrounding confidential sources. Leadership wanted results. Supervisors need reports to back up what the leadership wants in their results. Handlers need useful sources. Sources need to produce information. I'm going to stop right there because while there was no written order to provoke violence, this is what you need to understand. Confidential human sources are typically in two buckets. They're either people that are trying to roll over on other folks to get out of their own sentences, or they may in fact be long-term intelligence sources that started that way, but then actually became kind of sort of on the FBI's payroll. Not officially, because they're listed as confidential informants and there's no taxes withheld, etc. That's why Wray was able to make the statement that he was able to make in front of Congress. There were no FBI agents in the crowd on January 6th. However, we're now finding that while they didn't necessarily use agents, there are record of at least 26 confidential informants. And again, let's not forget, there's also been reports that according to another whistleblower, that their leadership was putting pressure on the agents involved with their handlers to make sure that they were able to yield results. And I'm going to say something the email didn't because it was kind of implied, but it basically left the impression of you're either going to get these people to say the things that we need them to say or else. So the source, because they have been told produce or else, learns which reports receive the most attention. The handler learns which threats leadership wants emphasized. The field office learns which cases headquarters wants opened, and headquarters receives the statistical picture it expected to find. That is how bureaucratic incentives can manufacture certainty without necessarily manufacturing the underlying event. The data becomes shaped by the demand. The threat assessment becomes shaped by the cases opened to prove that the threat existed in the first place, and the cases opened become shaped by the expectation that the threat must exist nationwide. Again, we need primary documentation before accusing specific officials of pressuring sources to provoke crimes. But the incentive question cannot be dismissed merely because the Inspector General found no formal authorization to incite violence. I'm going to say this name again. Anybody remember Ray Epps? Anybody? Bueller? Formal tasking is not the only way institutions influence behavior. People respond to expectations, rewards, and penalties. That is true in business. It is true in politics. It is true in journalism. And it is certainly true inside law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So when we learn that confidential sources were present, we cannot stop at that narrow question, were they explicitly ordered to break the law? We also have to ask what they believed they were expected to produce, whether continued usefulness shaped their behavior, and whether sources who crossed legal lines were treated differently from ordinary January 6th defendants. Those questions matter because the government later prosecuted people based on events unfolding in the same spaces where its own sources were present. The government cannot ask a jury to reconstruct the motives and actions of defendants while withholding or minimizing the role of its very own confidential sources that were standing beside them at the time. If a source encouraged movement towards a door, that matters. If a source urged restraint, that also matters. If a source knew of plans in advance, that definitely matters. If a source had no advanced knowledge at all, that point should be made. If every answer helps establish what kind of event January 6th actually was it centrally planned? Was it fragmented? Was it spontaneous? Were some groups preparing for violence and others weren't? Did informants merely observe? Did government sources enter only after the breach, or did they participate in events leading to it? Ray-ups. These are all factual questions. They are not ideological ones, and they require records the government possesses. Now, place that intelligence failure next to the security failure at the Capitol. Nancy Pelosi was recorded on January 6th during the evacuation, and that footage, she said they had totally failed, that they had to take responsibility for inadequate security accountability, and that she took full responsibility. However, she never really did. That statement has often been exaggerated to some. Pelosi's critics sometimes present it as a confession that she caused January 6th. I'm not saying that she caused it. I'm saying that she knew she could have done more to end it, and she chose not to. Her defenders sometimes treated it as meaningless expression of frustration. It was a lot more than that. Pelosi was acknowledging in real time that the institution had failed in one of its most basic responsibilities. The Capitol had not been prepared adequately for a foreseeable threat. So this is where we get back into that whole coincidence thing. So we had FBI failing to do their pre-threat canvass. You had confidential informants in the crowd. You had Nancy Pelosi refusing to do her job. It was her job as the Speaker of the House to do part of the protection of the Capitol. She refused to do it. She's then caught on video saying later that she should have done it. And then you start having to ask yourself, when all of these things all fail in the same direction, was it intentional or accidental? So this doesn't mean that Pelosi herself personally commanded the Capitol Police. It does mean that she would have been the one giving the orders to the House Sergeant at Arms to get in touch with Capitol Police and do whatever else needed to be done. We know that. We've gone over this multiple times on this very program. It doesn't mean that she directly controlled the DC National Guard either, but she was the one in charge of accepting the troops that Donald Trump had already made available. That's the part the media never wants to talk about. Donald Trump said these people are here if you need them. But he tried to follow procedure. The Capitol security structure involved the Capitol Police Board, the House and the Senate Sergeants at Arms, Capitol Police leadership, congressional leadership, the Defense Department, the DC government, and other law enforcement agencies. Responsibility was distributed, and that distribution itself contributed to delay, confusion, and failure. Or did it? See, we can keep making excuses for this stuff all day long. But who was in charge of all of those things at the time? How many times have we done stories about the corruption within the Capitol Police Department? I did an entire hour on it once. in a 2-hour broadcast about the corruption within the DC Capitol Police Department around the time that all this stuff was happening. We had Democrats who needed this kind of an event. They needed it. Because here's what they were able to do. Here's the part that nobody wants to say. And here's the part that I have to say with the words allegedly. What if I told you that allegedly everybody that was involved in this January 6th stuff knew about all the things that have been coming to light over the last few weeks and over the last several years? Not only did they know, but they've known the entire time. So whether they caused January 6th, whether they allowed lax procedures to facilitate January 6th, they still used it to their interests. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. Now, we can talk about the distribution itself and how that contributed to the delay and stuff that we had discussed earlier, but Pelosi's words matter because they reveal what she understood before the public narrative hardened. She understood the congressional leadership could be a target of the attack and still bear responsibility for inadequate preparation. She included herself in that responsibility. That matters because the official story that followed placed almost all the moral and political emphasis on Trump himself, along with the crowd and the people challenging certification. Those subjects deserved investigation. The violence deserved prosecution when applicable. The breach demanded accountability, but the security failure also required a genuinely independent investigation. Who received the warnings? Who dismissed them? Who underestimated the crowd? Who controlled requests for assistance? Who delayed their approvals? Who believed a stronger security presence would appear politically provocative? And why did the institution fail despite the political class having spent months warning that the election could produce a quote-unquote constitutional crisis? That last question returns us to the exercises. They had, in fact, imagined chaos. They had imagined mass demonstrations. They had imagined competing claims to political legitimacy. They had imagined congressional confrontation and extraordinary pressure surrounding the transfer of power. But when the real certification date arrived, the Capitol, even though they had wargamed this not once, but at least twice in the last 8 years, was not adequately secured. How do those two realities coexist in the same space at the same time? How does a political and institutional class spend months warning that Trump represents a unique threat to democracy, then fail to secure the building where the election would be certified? If they truly believed their own warnings, the security failure becomes harder to explain. If they did not believe the warnings, then the public rhetoric was dishonest on its face. Either way, they believed Trump and his supporters represented an extraordinary danger and failed inexplicably to prepare for that supposed extraordinary danger. Or did they not believe their own warnings until the resulting disorder became politically useful? Neither explanation reflects well on the institutions that were involved. And that is where the question of January 6th as a distraction begins to move from hindsight toward motive. We know January 6th became useful afterward. It allowed unresolved questions about the 2020 election, FBI conduct, intelligence handling, foreign interference, and institutional resistance to be recategorized as election denial or sympathy for and towards insurrection and insurrectionists. But did anyone understand beforehand that disorder at the Capitol would transform the political terrain? And if so, did that awareness influence how intelligence and security risks were handled? Now, I'm going to stop right there because if we go back to the war games that we talked about in hour one and all the different things that they gamed out, they knew this was a possibility. So if they had the awareness but didn't act on the awareness, what can that tell you? So based on the public evidence we've been going over today, I can't conclusively answer those questions to you, but I can point you towards what I believe the answer to be. Again, these people had wargamed this stuff out not once, but twice. Once in 2020, again in 2024. Both times treating Trump as an existential threat to democracy in their war games. And yet, having wargamed those things out, took no steps based on their own determinations to make sure that those things that did happen on January 6, 2021 did not happen. So you have to start asking yourself, why? Pelosi's immediate acknowledgement of inadequate preparation prevents us from pretending there was no institutional responsibility to examine, even if the media did try to remove that from the record almost immediately. And the FBI's confidential source record prevents us from pretending the federal government had no access to the environment producing the event. That gives us two established facts. The government had people inside of the relevant ecosystem, and the institution responsible for protecting the Capitol failed to prepare adequately after wargaming this not once but twice. The distance between those two facts is where the unanswered questions live. The Standard account asks us to believe that the FBI did not know enough despite its sources, that the Capitol was not prepared despite months of warnings, and everyone responsible was genuinely shocked when the kind of crisis they had been discussing and even wargaming out finally arrived. Maybe, but maybe is not a conclusion. It is an invitation to investigate. Now, we're going to take the final break of the show. After the break, we move from the failure to prepare into the evidence used afterwards, starting with testimony from Pelosi's protective detail that reportedly conflicts with time-stamped surveillance footage. Then we ask what happens when the institutions implicated in the failures control the witnesses, the evidence, the prosecutions, and the investigations. I'm Rick Robinson. This is my show. We'll be right back, so stay tuned.
I've seen the fire in our nation's eyes when anger prowls for prey. I've heard good people draw their lines and call it holy rage, but the cross was never raised to bless the stones we throw. And if mercy leaves the house, there's something wrong down in the soul. Words ain't bullets, but they can hit the same. And once a heart turns cold enough, it forgets what grace is for. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No, no room for hate. No room for hate. You can wave a flag above it, you can quote a verse or two, you can dress it up like justice, till it almost sounds like truth. But outrage ain't righteous when it changes with the side. And you can't love your neighbor, treating them like they're downrange. We're all image bearers, breath of God and dust. And you don't heal a broken land by teaching it not to trust. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. If Jesus owns the house, then hatred don't got no place. No room for hate. No room for hate. No room for hate. Drag it to the cross, lay it in the ground. Let the blood of Jesus turn the whole thing around. Truth can still be spoken, courage still can stand, but rage don't get to rule the soul of a faithful man. There's no room for hate in America tonight. No room in the home where the children need the light. No room in the heart where the Savior's supposed to stay. and hatred don't got no place.
Let revival start
Oh,
where the anger breaks.
where the anger breaks.
Let healing rise up
Oh,
where the hurt gives way.
no room for hate.
No room for hate.
No, no room for hate.
No room for hate.
Not in Jesus' name. Oh, not in this house. Not in this heart. Not in his name. No room for hate.
The following program contains coarse language and adult themes. Listener discretion is
Drop in a red state parade from the plains to the power. He's speaking it loud with a mic and a mission that makes us proud. Talk for the people, talk that's real. The Rick Robinson Show, where we say what we feel.
All right. Final segment of the show. I know this one's been kind of intensive. And I broke one of my own rules. I usually don't try to put together scripts, but this was going to be pretty data intensive. So normally I have kind of rough outlines, so if I get distracted too long, I can go back to my notes. This one was more scripted than I normally like to do, but there was a reason because there was lots of things to connect together. So welcome back in. Before the break, we established two facts. The federal government had confidential human sources inside the broader January 6th environment, and the institution responsible for protecting the Capitol failed to prepare adequately for a foreseeable threat that, again, I would like to point out they had wargamed about not just once, but twice. The Justice Department Inspector General did not find evidence the FBI or that FBI headquarters ordered sources to storm the Capitol or formally authorized them to commit crimes. I submit to you about these alleged potentialities, though, that would be something that we would call, if it is correct, plausible deniability. The Inspector General also did not identify potentially critical intelligence about an attack that had been withheld from law enforcement partners. Those findings matter, but the same investigation found that 26 FBI confidential human sources were in Washington for events connected to January 6th, that 4 entered the Capitol, that 13 more entered the restricted perimeter, and that the Bureau failed to conduct the nationwide pre-event canvass that could have produced a more complete threat picture after being involved in wargaming that very same thing. I know I keep saying that a lot, but there's a reason. Nancy Pelosi, meanwhile, was recorded during the evacuation saying, "We have totally failed," discussing the failure to hold security accountable and saying, "I take full responsibility." However, she didn't, though. Presence is not orchestration. The security failure is not proof of deliberate facilitation. But when government sources are present, security fails, intelligence procedures are missed, and Congress later receives an inaccurate account from what the FBI did before the event, the public is entitled to ask, what exactly happened here? Now we move from the failures before January 6th to the evidence used afterward. And that brings us to David Lazarus. Lazarus was a special agent with the United States Capitol Police who served on Nancy Pelosi's protective detail. During the Oath Keepers trial, Lazarus testified about seeing an encounter involving Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn and members of the Oath Keepers inside the Capitol. His account appeared to corroborate Dunn's testimony concerning the group's conduct towards officers. Subsequent reporting and congressional investigators argued that time-stamped Capitol surveillance footage placed Lazarus elsewhere during the portions of the relevant period and undermined his account. In point of fact, he was over 100 yards away in an underground parking garage when he claims to have witnessed these events. Capitol Police, however, disputed that conclusion. The department said Lazarus had not tied his observation to a precise time that he testified he could see, done above him while coming up the stairs, and that some relevant interactions may have occurred outside the camera views relied upon by the investigators. That does not automatically resolve the discrepancy, however, but it means we must describe this accurately. This is a contested conflict between the testimony and one interpretation of the surveillance video. It is not established proof that footage made Lazarus' account impossible. However, Occam's razor. Capitol Police also emphasized that the disputed Dunn-related material was a small portion of Lazarus' overall testimony and argued it was unlikely to have driven the verdicts. That counterpoint matters, even if I kind of disagree with it. A conflict between testimony and video does not automatically prove perjury. Human memory is imperfect. Witnesses confuse timing. Events unfold rapidly. A person may misremember where something happened, when it happened, or whether they saw it directly or learned about it moments later. However, learning about it moments later means that you acquired it from another source, which would have made it hearsay. Perjury requires more than an accurate statement. It requires a knowingly false material statement under oath. However, I would like to point out again that timestamps show he was 100 yards away during the time frame that these events were supposed to be occurring that he claimed to have first-hand witnessed. You can tell me that's not perjury all day long, but hopefully a lot of you remember what I used to do for a living. Capitol Police initially handled the complaint through its Office of Professional Responsibility, which concluded that the perjury allegation was not substantiated under a more likely than not standard. The police chief then said he referred the matter to the department's inspector general for an independent review. That does not prove his Lazarus testimony was accurate, however. It means the department said it could not establish that he deliberately lied. Those are different conclusions. And the central issue is larger than whether Lazarus should have been prosecuted. The issue is whether the evidence was handled transparently, who prepared him to testify, who interviewed him before trial, who reviewed the available Capitol video, who compared the expected testimony with the actual timestamps. When did prosecutors learn that investigators disputed his own account? Did the defense receive the information needed to challenge it? Was the testimony clarified once the conflict became apparent? And what did the independent review ultimately determine? Those are fair questions, even if Lazarus made what could be considered an honest mistake, and that's doing a lot of lifting. They are fair questions, even if his testimony played only a small role in the broader case, and they are fair because the institution employing the witness also controlled much of the relevant surveillance material. That is the structural problem. The Capitol Police employed the witness and controlled much of the video. Federal prosecutors presented the case. Federal agencies had sources inside the January 6th environment. Congress investigated an attack that also exposed failures involving congressional security. Members of congressional leadership had their own preparation discussions underway, or decisions under examination, and the institution implicated in different parts of the failure were repeatedly asked to explain their own conduct. That does not mean every investigation was fraudulent. It does not mean every prosecutor acted improperly. It does not mean every witness lied, but it does mean the public should not be asked to grant unconditional confidence merely because an institution was allowed to review itself. Imagine this structure in another context. A corporation experiences a catastrophic security failure. Its employees become witnesses. Its cameras hold disputed evidence. Its executives face questions about preparation. Its own investigators examine the conduct, and its lawyers control the disclosure. Then the corporation announces that deliberate wrongdoing was not substantiated. Would that end the matter? Of course it wouldn't. We would still want an independent review of the raw evidence, the witness preparation, the contemporaneous records, and who knew what and when they knew it. January 6th deserves that same level of independence. Instead, questioning the process was often treated as minimizing the riot. That is how a real event becomes a narrative shield. January 6th was real. The breach that occurred was real. The assaults, even if some of them were elevated and aggrandized, were real. People did in fact commit crimes. Officers were placed in danger. Property was damaged. The constitutional certification process was at least marginally disrupted. Nothing we have discussed today requires denying any of that. In fact, those realities are what gave January 6th such enormous political power. Questions about election administration became election denial. Questions about FBI conduct became hostility toward law enforcement. Questions about intelligence handling became a conspiracy theory. Questions about confidential sources became accusations that the entire event was staged. Questions about security failures became attempts to blame the victims. Questions about witness credibility became sympathy for defendants. Questions about due process became support for insurrection. Every distinction collapsed, and once those distinctions collapsed, institutions no longer had to answer every question on its merits standing on its own. They could instead judge the identity of the person asking. Are you one of them, You're defending January 6th, aren't you? Why are you undermining democracy? That rhetorical move in and of itself was extraordinarily effective. Before January 6th, unresolved issues included election administration, foreign influence, intelligence reporting, FBI credibility, mail ballot procedures, pandemic-era rule changes, and organized political resistance. After January 6th, those subjects could be placed behind one emotionally overwhelming image, the Capitol breach. You either accepted the broad official framing or risked being placed on the side of the mob. Again, made evident by the cauliflower in chief being flanked by Marines, flanked by American flags, draped in red lights, making some of the same motions with his hands that can be captured in Hitler videos, talking about half the country being terrorists because of this very event. January 6th did not merely produce prosecutions, it produced a governing narrative. Agencies and officials with their own unanswered questions became guardians of democracy. Resistance planning became civic responsibility. Surveillance and informant use became protection from extremism. Extraordinary government actions became necessary because of January 6th. And the institution's own accounts were treated as trustworthy because those same institutions were investigating none other than January 6th. That is rather circular reasoning, in my humble opinion. The institutions were trustworthy because they investigated the crisis. And their account of the crisis was trustworthy because those institutions produced it. That is not independent, verifiable accountability. That is institutional insulation. Now we arrive at the hardest question of the day. Was January 6th merely exploited after it happened, or did some institutional actors understand its potential political usefulness beforehand? To answer that question, I'm going to pose another one to you because I can't legally answer that question for you, but I can do this. Do you believe, now knowing that these things had been war gamed out first in 2020 and again in 2024, that there were people that were involved in these simulations that did not understand how politically useful this could be? Those are not the same allegation. The first proposition is strongly supported by what followed. January 6th was repeatedly used to discredit or shut down broader scrutiny. I do that every time. Label political opposition as extremist and justify expanded institutional power. We watched that happen in real time. The second proposition is more difficult. Did anyone foresee that visible disorder at the Capitol would change the political landscape? Again, I have to answer that with a question. Do you believe that the same groups that had wargamed this out not once but twice didn't think this was a possibility, and the fact that they chose not to take steps to help correct for that possibility, do you honestly think it was all happenstance? Because the fact that it could be used to change the political landscape is plausible. Political strategists had spent months, just like I had said a moment ago, gaming disputed election scenarios. Officials had warned repeatedly about potential unrest. Law enforcement had sources connected to relevant subjects and groups. Congressional leaders knew certification would occur amid extraordinary tension. Anyone familiar with politics could recognize that a breach of the Capitol would overwhelm every competing story. But recognizing that possibility is not necessarily the same as causing it, and I'm not necessarily saying they caused it. I am saying that through a cascading failure of events, my opinion is that they allowed it. Foreknowledge, facilitation, orchestration, and later political benefit are different propositions. The evidence must not be stretched from one into another. The public evidence does not yet prove that government officials staged January 6th. While we can't prove that, we do know that they knew enough based on their war games to take steps to make sure things like what happened in January 6th didn't happen, and they seem to have done the exact opposite. It does not prove that congressional leaders deliberately left the Capitol vulnerable so a riot could occur, but it doesn't disprove that either. And again, I go back to the fact that you know as well as I do that Nancy Pelosi was probably privy to all the war game data that they had done in both 2020 and 2024. It does not prove the FBI sources were ordered to provoke the breach. And I'll be honest, there's going to be no way that we're ever going to be able to prove that, because there would have been nowhere that was actually documented in a way that's going to be verifiable in a court of law. But I would like to remind you guys of such a thing as plausible deniability. It does not prove that every disputed witness statement was knowingly false, because it doesn't have to. The people that were there, some of the people that witnessed it actually did witness it, and they weren't part of the mechanism that the FBI had in place with their informants. The evidence establishes enough to make dismissal unacceptable. Political and institutional figures had rehearsed extraordinary resistance multiple times. The FBI had people inside the relevant environment. The Bureau missed an intelligence gathering step. Senior officials later said should have occurred. The Capitol was not adequately prepared despite months of warnings and years of wargaming. Pelosi acknowledged the failure in real time and then acted as if she never said the same thing at a later time. A government witness later gave testimony challenged by congressional investigators relying on government surveillance video. Capitol Police disputed their interpretation and said the testimony was not shown to be deliberately false just because he was in another part of the complex when the fight supposedly occurred. And January 6th became the political shield behind which many other institutional questions were placed. That is not proof of a single master conspiracy. It is evidence of an institutional ecosystem that allowed for preparation, shared assumptions, information control, bureaucratic incentives, security failure, institutional self-protection, and enormous benefit from the event later defined for the public. Benefit does not necessarily mean cause, but benefit creates an incentive to preserve a narrative. Once January 6th became the foundation for prosecutions, committee hearings, intelligence priorities, political messaging, and a national campaign against election denial, correcting the record became institutionally expensive. Admitting that intelligence had been mishandled could weaken confidence in the guardrails that they had set up around this supposed insurrection. Admitting that informants were more deeply embedded than initially understood could and would complicate the public account. Admitting that the security failure was foreseeable could redirect blame. Admitting that testimony might conflict with evidence could weaken competence in prosecutions. Admitting that some legitimate election questions actually did exist could undermine the narrative's moral simplicity. That does not require one central command. The prosecutor protects the case. The agency protects its sources and methods. The police department protects its personnel and its own reputation. Congress protects its committees and leadership. Media organizations protect the story they told. Political figures protect the language they used. Each actor protects a different part. The combined effect is a wall. That is how institutional narratives survive. Not because every person knows the whole truth, because every institution has something to lose by reopening its portion of the record. And that is why the alleged burn bag documents matter. President Trump alleged in his July 16 address that Obama-era documents had been found in FBI burn bags. At this stage, that assertion requires documentary verification. Burn bags in and of themselves are not inherently sinister. Government agencies routinely use them to dispose of classified or sensitive material. The existence of a burn bag does not prove a cover-up. The questions are what was inside, where the materials came from, and whether it was actually designated for destruction. Were the documents originals or duplicates? What retention schedule applied? Who placed them there? Under whose authority? What is the chain of custody? Were any documents connected to election intelligence, surveillance, source handling, or presidential briefing? Were they actually scheduled for destruction? And if so, under what authority? If those questions require the records themselves, those questions do, in fact, unfortunately, require the records themselves. Physical evidence matters because it can survive institutional storytelling. A witness may misremember. An official may revise an explanation. An agency may characterize an event. A committee may decide which testimony to emphasize. But a dated memo, an original briefing, draft, a handler communication, a tasking document, or a surveillance timestamp narrows the range of possible stories. Records allow the public to test official claims. Too often, the public receives conclusions before they ever see the records, or as we call them around here, the receipts. Labels before evidence, redactions before explanations, committee preparations and presentations before full access to surveillance material, and institutional assurances from the institutions whose conduct was under examination in the first place. When records later emerged, Americans were told it was too late to revisit the story. It is never too late to correct the historical record. It is never too late to determine whether testimony was accurate, whether intelligence was properly handled, how government sources were used, or why security failed. And it is never too late to demand that institutions claiming to defend quote-unquote democracy submit themselves to democratic scrutiny. Did it again. The standard is not whether the evidence helps Trump. It is not whether it hurts Trump. It is not whether it embarrasses the FBI, congressional leadership, prosecutors, or the media. The standard is whether it is in fact true. And truth requires distinctions. A riot can be real and government conduct can still require investigation. People can commit crimes and confidential source activity can still matter. Pelosi can be a target and congressional leadership can still bear responsibility for inadequate security. A witness can avoid a perjury finding and the testimony can still deserve scrutiny. An intelligence report can be unverified and its handling can still be improper. An exercise can be legal and the mindset it reveals can still be politically significant. January 6th was not nothing. In the words of the leftist media that said this all through the Barack Obama years, I'm going to say it was mostly peaceful. It was not an event and scenario, though. It was not a magical event that erased every government failure before it and justified every government action after it. It cannot excuse faulty intelligence practices. It cannot excuse inadequate security. It cannot excuse selective disclosures. It cannot excuse institutional self-investigation. And it cannot turn every unanswered question into shouts of treason. I'm not claiming today that January 6th was staged. I'm asking whether people who had rehearsed political resistance, embedded sources in relevant groups, controlled sensitive intelligence, failed to secure the Capitol, and later benefited enormously from the breach were truly as surprised by the outcome as they had claimed. That question deserves evidence. It deserves the complete video. It deserves the source tasking and the handle of the record. It deserves the original intelligence reports and the briefing drafts. It deserves the communications surrounding security decisions, and it deserves review by people without institutional conflicts. The evidence does not yet prove they built the fire, but it does prove that they had planned for the fire. It proves government sources were standing near the flames. It proves the alarms were not used as effectively as they should have been. It proves the building was not adequately prepared. And it proves that many of the same institutions later helped write the official, quote unquote, in the analogy we're using right now, fire report. That is why we keep asking, not because every suspicion is true, not because every rumor deserves belief, and not because Donald Trump must be vindicated in every dispute. You guys have heard me disagree with him vehemently on this very program before. We keep asking because democratic institutions cannot demand trust while withholding the evidence required to earn that trust. Trust is not obedience. Trust is a result of transparency, accountability, and truth. An exercise does not prove execution. It does, however, prove that there was preparation. A source does not prove orchestration. It does prove proximity. A failure does not prove intent, but it does create a need for responsibility. A contradiction does not automatically prove perjury unless there's a timestamp. It requires examination. An institutional benefit does not prove institutional design. It creates motive to preserve the story. That is where the evidence takes us today, not to a finished verdict, not to a justified investigation, not to certainty about every motive, to certainty that the official count was never sufficient by itself. The riot was real. The unanswered questions are also real. The record involving those events is real. The institutional interests are real, and the possibility that those facts belong in the same conversation is not a conspiracy theory, no matter how much people on the left want you to think that it is. It is the beginning of true accountability. I'm Rick Robinson. This has been The Rick Robinson Show. Until next time, keep asking the questions they tell you are verboten. The truth does not become dangerous because someone calls it misinformation. The truth becomes dangerous when institutions are afraid of what happens after the public sees that very truth. All right, folks, that's again going to do it for this one. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to hang out today. Had pretty solid numbers since I didn't promote beforehand. Try to do a better job of promoting Wednesday's show because I have sucked at that lately. But no show for me tonight. Gonna rest the vocal cords a bit because still struggling a bit. But we're trying to get back closer to full-time schedule. But I will be present for Men Explained Poorly tomorrow night, 10 a.m. Eastern with the crew. We're going to talk about how influencers are destroying manhood. Yeah, there's some relevant news coming out that we're going to talk about on the show tomorrow night. And then I'll be back Wednesday afternoon for the Rick Robinson Show. Don't forget, after Men Explained Poorly, they'll hang out with BZ. Come hang out in the saloon. Start a tab. The drinks aren't free, but he does let you run a tab. Bye, everybody.
Just an eagle in the sky from DC to Tulsa, he's calling it out. Mic in his hand, yeah, he's got the clout. Heartland Radio, raw and real, tune in, speak up and feel what we feel. He's breaking down the noise, cutting through the lies, shining light where the shadow hides. With guests in the mix and callers on cue, he's a voice for the many.
Say goodnight, Gracie.
Raise that flag, stand your ground, never wave that rag. News with a backbone, voice of the free. Rick's got the pulse of liberty. It's a Rick Robinson Show, bold on.